Hi, everybody. I want to talk to you today about a really significant report that came out a couple of weeks ago that has caused some real shockwaves around the world. And I want to talk to you specifically about its relevance to Australia. This report came out last week and it came from a group known as the International Energy Agency, or the IEA. The IEA has been around for many decades. It was originally set up by Henry Kissinger to protect the supply of oil for oil-producing nations. And it has developed a reputation over the years of not being particularly favorable towards renewable energy and being, I guess, slightly favored towards fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas. And what we're seeing is a really serious shift away from that position from the International Energy Agency. The reason being is that a lot of fossil fuel companies will point to their scenarios and present them as if they're forecasts of continued demand for fossil fuels into the future. But what those reports were not doing was considering ambitious climate action in their scenarios, and that has changed. And the IEA published a report last week that came out with the finding that for the world to align to net zero by 2050, and that's keeping the world's temperatures underneath a level of 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels, then a bunch of really serious things need to happen in the very short term. The first thing they mentioned was the phase out of coal power. In advanced economies, that needs to be by the year 2030. And for the rest of the world, it needs to be around 2035 to 2040. Of course, the sooner the better. The other major thing that they mentioned, and this was the thing that got a lot of the headlines, is that investment in new fossil fuel extraction needs to stop. And so they specify coal mines and they specify oil. But this really sent waves through particularly the fossil fuel industry, because a lot of what they do is not just about continuing the extraction of all of their current sites, but also trying to grow their companies, trying to increase the amount of fossil fuels they extract. So this really marked a very significant thing, because these companies can no longer point to the IEA and say, look, these people confirm what we've been telling you, that we need to continue extracting fossil fuels and particularly looking for new sites for fossil fuels. That was a really big deal. And the other point that's relevant is that they called for a change to transportation policies. So specifically, by the year 2035, globally, we need to stop selling combustion engines. It should be basically impossible to buy a combustion engine car within 15 years. That's a big deal because, of course, that means major infrastructure changes in cities and in countries around the world, specifically around charging capabilities. That means, of course, we need to start today. We need to start right now. I live in Norway, where this has already started, but it should really have started around the world a lot sooner. So this is a real problem for Australia. Australia's coal plant will retire, according to its sort of natural life, I guess, by 2050, 2060-ish. That is a very long overshoot over a 2030 deadline. But a report from Australia's grid operator that came out last year looked at the timeframes for coal phase out and found that you could actually accelerate this to well before this timeline and make sure that Australia aligns much more closely with climate goals. The other major problem for Australia, of course, is that Australia's oil and gas companies and their coal companies are looking to expand their operations. There are a whole bunch of new coal mines planned in New South Wales and Queensland, comfortably the largest list of new planned coal mines for export in the world. And Australia is really having to struggle with the whole idea of new coal mines now because the IEA has come out with this report. And this is really going to have some significant impacts on the election that's coming up in Australia pretty soon. So it's going to be really fascinating to see how this plays out over the course of this year. Of course, there are a few more big climate meetings. There's the G7 meeting at the end of June. And of course, there is the huge COP26 meeting at the end of the year. The narrative has already changed. 3 months ago, this was completely different. Even a few weeks ago, this was completely different. And the rate of change feels like it's accelerating. It's not really something that I say lightly because, of course, I try to remain as skeptical as I can about what all of these things mean. But this, for once, actually feels like a really significant change. So keep your eyes on it, pay attention to where it's mentioned, and just see how it's used. It's really important.